The stars had never looked so beautiful as they did from the bridge of the Terra Nova. Captain Jake Morrison stood at the main viewport, watching the swirling colors of hyperspace fade away as his ship dropped back into normal space. 3 years of exploration had brought them farther from Earth than any human had ever traveled before. The year 2387 would be remembered as the year humanity truly reached for the stars. Jake checked his instruments one more time. The new faster-than-light drive was still experimental, but it had performed flawlessly on their journey. Behind him, his crew of 25 worked quietly at their stations. They were explorers, scientists, and dreamers who had volunteered for this mission knowing they might never see Earth again. The Terra Nova carried the hopes of an entire species in her metal hull. The warning klaxon suddenly filled the bridge. With its urgent sound, Lieutenant Amy Foster looked up from her sensor station with wide eyes. Something big was moving toward them through space. The signatures were unlike anything in their databases. Jake felt his heart race as he realized what this meant. After centuries of wondering if humanity was alone in the universe, they were about to get their answer. The alien ship was massive, easily 10 times the size of the Terra Nova. Its hull gleamed with a strange blue metal that seemed to shift and change in the light of nearby stars. Strange symbols covered its surface, glowing with soft purple light. Jake had studied every Earth vessel ever built, but this was something entirely different. This was proof that intelligence existed beyond their small blue world. Communications. Officer Sam Rodriguez worked frantically at his station, trying every frequency they knew. Static filled the bridge speakers until suddenly a voice cut through the noise. It spoke in perfect English, though the accent was unlike anything Jake had ever heard. The words came slowly, as if the speaker was thinking carefully about each. 1. The voice belonged to Commander Veltar of the Korathi Exploration Fleet. Through the static, he explained that his people had been watching human space for several decades. They had seen the first human satellites, witnessed the moon landings, and observed humanity's first tentative steps toward the stars. The Korathi had been waiting for this moment when humans would finally venture far enough from home to make contact possible. Jake felt the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders as he responded. Every word he spoke would be recorded and studied by future generations. He introduced himself and his crew, explained their peaceful mission of exploration, and asked the question that had burned in human minds for centuries. Were they alone in the universe? Commander Veltar's answer changed everything. The galaxy was full of intelligent life, he explained. Dozens of species had achieved spaceflight and joined together in something called the Galactic Council. For over 10,000 years, these species had worked together to maintain peace and prosperity across the known universe. They shared technology, traded resources, and helped younger species develop their potential. The conversation lasted for hours. Jake learned that the Korathi were master engineers who had perfected faster-than-light travel millennia ago. Their ships could cross the galaxy in weeks rather than years. They had built massive space stations and terraformed barren worlds into gardens. Most importantly, they were peaceful beings who believed in cooperation rather than conquest. Commander Veltar explained that humanity had impressed many council observers. Most species took thousands of years to develop from primitive civilization to spaceflight. Humans had done it in mere centuries. Their rapid technological advancement, combined with their apparent peaceful intentions, made them excellent candidates for council membership. Jake could barely contain his excitement as he sent word back to Earth through their quantum communication array. The message would take weeks to reach home, but it would be the most important transmission in human history. Humanity was not alone, and they have been invited to join a galactic community of peaceful species. The formal invitation arrived 3 months later through official diplomatic channels. Admiral Lisa Carter, Earth's most experienced space commander, read the elegant document with growing amazement. The Galactic Council formally invited humanity to apply for membership as a junior species. Representatives would be welcome to attend council sessions on Nexus Prime, the seat of galactic government, Admiral Carter assembled the finest team Earth could offer. Diplomat Sam Rodriguez had years of experience in international relations and had spent months learning what little humanity knew about galactic politics. Dr. Emma Walsh was one of Earth's leading xenobiologists, specially chosen for her ability to understand alien psychology and culture. Captain Rick Davis brought military expertise, though everyone hoped it would never be needed. The journey to Nexus Prime took 2 weeks aboard the newly constructed diplomatic vessel New Horizon. The ship represented the best of human engineering, incorporating several improvements inspired by the brief technical exchange with Commander Veltar. As they approached the council seat, the human delegation stared in wonder at what they saw. Nexus Prime was a massive space station, larger than any city on Earth. It hung in space like a jeweled crown, its countless lights twinkling against the darkness. Ships from dozens of different species docked at its many ports. Some vessels were elegant and flowing like living creatures, while others were geometric and precise like mathematical equations. Made real, the docking procedure was handled by beings Admiral Carter would later learn were called Velnari. They were natural diplomats with voices like silver bells and an uncanny ability to make everyone feel welcome. They guided the New Horizon to a berth reserved for first-time visitors and provided translation devices that would allow the humans to communicate with any council species. Admiral Carter led her team through corridors that seemed to stretch forever. The walls were covered with art from 1,000 different worlds, each piece representing the unique culture of its creators. They passed beings of every imaginable shape and size. Some walked on legs like humans, while others floated through the air or moved on mechanical appendages. The council chambers themselves were breathtaking. The room was vast enough to hold representatives from all member species, with seating arranged in concentric circles around a central speaking area. The senior council members sat in the inner rings, their seats elevated and ornate. The junior members occupied the outer rings, their seating more modest but still comfortable. Admiral Carter felt a surge of pride as she and her team were escorted to their designated seats in the junior section. They were really here, representing all of humanity in the halls of galactic power. The other junior species representatives seemed friendly enough, offering welcoming gestures and curious glances at the newest arrivals. The council session began with Speaker Theron of the Zephyrians calling for order. He was an impressive figure, tall and graceful, with skin that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. His voice carried easily through the vast chamber as he welcomed the human delegation and formally recognized their junior membership status. But as the session continued, Admiral Carter began to notice something troubling. When junior species representatives tried to speak, they were often ignored or politely dismissed. Their suggestions were noted but never acted upon. Their concerns were acknowledged but never addressed. The senior species spoke to them like adults speaking to children who didn't quite understand how the world really worked. Still, Admiral Carter told herself this was just the beginning. Humanity would prove themselves worthy of full membership through hard work and dedication. They would earn their place among the stars through patience and perseverance. After all, what were a few years of junior status compared to the chance to join a community that spanned the galaxy? As the human delegation settled into their quarters aboard Nexus Prime, they began planning for the future. There was so much to learn, so many opportunities to explore. They would study council procedures, build relationships with other species, and slowly work their way up from junior status to full membership. None of them suspected that some of those junior species had been waiting for that promotion for thousands of years. None of them realized that the beautiful council chambers were built on a foundation of systematic oppression. They went to sleep that first night filled with hope and dreams of a bright future among the stars. The dreams would not last long. Admiral Lisa Carter stood before the council proposal board for the 5th time in 6 months. The holographic display showed her carefully prepared presentation about establishing human medical facilities on 3 council worlds suffering from disease outbreaks. Earth's medical technology had advanced rapidly during their isolation. And human doctors had developed treatments that could save thousands of lives. Speaker Theron listened politely, his shimmering skin reflecting the chamber's soft lighting. When Admiral Carter finished her presentation, he smiled that same gentle smile she had grown to recognize. The proposal would be forwarded to the Medical Assessment Committee for a thorough review. They would consider humanity's request and provide a response within the standard time frame of 18 months. 18 months for people who were dying today. Admiral Carter kept her expression neutral as she thanked the speaker and returned to her seat in the junior section. Around her, representatives from other junior species nodded sympathetically. They had all learned to recognize that smile and what it really meant. Dr. Emma Walsh waited for Admiral Carter in the corridor outside the chambers. As humanity's chief xenobiologist, she had spent the past year studying council procedures and culture. What she had discovered troubled her more each day. The council operated on something called consensus building, which sounded reasonable, until you realized that only senior species had voting rights on important matters. Junior species could make proposals, offer suggestions, and participate in discussions. But when it came time for actual decisions, they sat quietly while the 12 senior species decided their fate. Emma had watched the same pattern repeat dozens of times. Junior species would identify problems, propose solutions, and then wait years for permission to help their own people. Commander Rick Davis joined them as they walked toward the human quarters. As Earth's military liaison, he had been observing Council security procedures and fleet movements. What he saw made no tactical sense unless you understood the real power structure. Senior species maintained massive fleets while junior species were limited to small patrol vessels and cargo ships. The three humans entered their shared meeting room and activated the privacy shield. The device was a gift from the Korathi, supposedly to help junior species conduct private discussions. Rick suspected it also allowed the council to monitor everything they said, but they had no choice but to use it. Admiral Carter spread her hands on the table and looked at her colleagues. 1 year of council membership had taught them harsh lessons about galactic politics. Every human proposal had been delayed, deferred, or declined. Their offers to share Earth's agricultural advances were met with concerns about biological contamination. Their suggestions for improving trade routes were rejected as premature. Even their simple request to establish cultural exchange programs was buried in bureaucratic review. Dr. Walsh opened her datapad and shared what she had learned from other junior species representatives. The Kelrani had been council members for over 3,000 years. They had submitted the same proposal for establishing independent research facilities 47 times. Each submission was carefully reviewed and politely rejected with suggestions for minor improvements. The Torvan delegation had been waiting 800 years for permission to upgrade their planetary defense systems. Their homeworld was located near pirate-infested space, but the Council insisted that junior species should rely on senior species protection rather than developing their own military capabilities. Most shocking of all was the story of the Mindari. Their species had developed revolutionary clean energy technology that could solve power shortages across the galaxy. They had been trying to share this technology for 600 years, but the Council required them to undergo comprehensive safety testing that seemed to have no end date. Commander Davis pulled up fleet deployment records that had been shared during a recent security briefing. The pattern was obvious once you knew what to look for. Senior species controlled all the strategic star systems, major trade routes, and resource-rich planets. Junior species were granted territories on the galactic rim, far from centers of power and wealth. The resource allocation reports told an even clearer story. Junior species worlds were required to contribute raw materials to Council reserves at fixed prices set by senior species committees. These materials were then sold to Council members at market rates that were typically 3 to 5 times higher than what the junior species received. Admiral Carter felt anger building in her chest as she studied the numbers. Humanity was essentially being asked to strip mine their colonies to provide cheap resources for beings who lived in luxury while human settlements struggled with basic infrastructure needs. The beautiful speeches about cooperation and mutual benefit were just words that covered a system designed to keep most species in permanent servitude. Dr. Walsh had made another disturbing discovery during her research into council history. She had found records of species that had attempted to challenge the system or demand equal treatment. Some had been expelled from the council entirely, their trade agreements canceled, and their territories isolated. Others had simply disappeared from the records with no explanation of what had happened to them. The three humans spent hours discussing what they had learned. The Galactic Council was not the benevolent organization it pretended to be. It was a carefully constructed system that allowed 12 ancient species to maintain control over younger civilizations through a combination of false promises and economic manipulation. But challenging the system directly seemed impossible. The senior species had thousands of years of experience in managing rebellious junior members. They had perfected the art of making resistance seem unreasonable, ungrateful, and ultimately futile. Commander Davis suggested they begin documenting everything they observed. If humanity was ever going to break free from this system, they would need evidence of how it really worked. They would need to understand the weaknesses in the Council's power structure and find ways to exploit them. Admiral Carter agreed, but she also wanted to reach out to other junior species. Humans had always been good at building alliances and finding common ground with different groups. Perhaps other species were as frustrated with their treatment as humanity was becoming. Dr. Walsh volunteered to make informal contact with junior species representatives. Her background in xenobiology gave her insights into different cultural approaches to communication. She could learn how other species viewed their council membership and whether any of them might be willing to work together for change. The meeting ended with a plan to gather information while maintaining the appearance of loyal council members. They would smile at the condescending speeches, thank the senior species for their wisdom, and quietly build a network of contacts among the junior members. As Admiral Carter returned to her quarters that evening, she thought about the message she would send to Earth in her next scheduled report. How could she explain to humanity that their dreams of joining a galactic community had led them into a cosmic plantation system? How could she tell billions of humans that their greatest achievement had made them servants to beings who saw them as useful but inferior? The view from her window showed the gleaming corridors of Nexus Prime, filled with representatives from dozens of worlds. It looked like a paradise of cooperation and shared purpose. But Admiral Carter now understood that the beautiful facade hid an ugly truth about power, control, and the price of admission to the galactic community. Tomorrow she would smile and nod as Speaker Theron explained why humanity's latest proposal needed more review. She would thank him for his patience with such a young species. But inside, she would be planning for the day when humanity would no longer need to ask permission to help their own people. That day was coming sooner than anyone suspected. Dr. Matt Thompson adjusted his Cultural Exchange Coordinator badge as he walked through the junior species residential sector of Nexus Prime. His official job was to help new council members adapt to galactic society. But over the past 6 months, he had been doing something much more important. He was building bridges between species that had been kept apart for centuries. The Kelrani representative, Ambassador Yukianor, met him at the entrance to the botanical gardens. The gardens were one of the few places on Nexus Prime where junior species could meet without senior oversight. Among the flowering plants from a dozen worlds, conversations could happen that might change the course of galactic history. Matt had learned that the Kelrani were master mathematicians who had developed computational systems far superior to anything the Council officially used. Their homeworld possessed rare minerals essential for advanced technology, but they were forced to export these materials at prices that barely covered extraction costs. Meanwhile, the finished products made from their minerals were sold at enormous profits by senior species corporations. Ambassador Yukianor spoke in careful whispers as they walked between towering blue trees from his homeworld. His people had been documenting Council exploitation for over 1,000 years. They had detailed records of resource extraction quotas, trade agreement violations, and systematic suppression of junior species innovation. The mathematics were clear and damning. Lieutenant Amy Foster had used her security clearance to map the power structure of the entire council system. As part of the joint security detail protecting Nexus Prime, she had access to databases that most junior species never saw. What she discovered would have shocked the senior council members. If they had bothered to pay attention to what a human security officer was learning, the council controlled 47 star systems directly and maintained economic dominance over 312 additional systems through trade agreements and resource contracts. The senior species had divided the galaxy into exclusive zones where only they could establish major industrial facilities or research centers. Junior species were limited to providing raw materials and basic manufacturing. Amy had also discovered the communication monitoring systems that senior species used to watch junior members. Every official message was scanned, every proposal was analyzed, and every complaint was cataloged. The senior species maintained detailed psychological profiles of junior species leaders, noting their frustrations and potential for causing trouble, but the monitoring systems had a weakness that their creators never anticipated. They were designed to watch for traditional forms of rebellion like military buildups or formal protests. They were not configured to detect something as simple as humans, making friends with other species and sharing information during casual conversations. Captain Joe Martinez commanded a small merchant vessel that carried trade goods between junior species worlds. His ship, the Wandering Star, looked like an ordinary cargo hauler, but it had been quietly modified with communication equipment that allowed secure messaging between trusted contacts. Joe had spent his entire adult life in space and knew how to make his ship invisible to official surveillance. During his regular trade runs, Joe carried more than manufactured goods and agricultural products. Hidden in cargo containers and personal belongings were data storage devices containing information that junior species were not supposed to share with each other. Technical specifications, economic analyses, and detailed reports about council exploitation were slowly spreading through a network that senior species never suspected existed. Dr. Susan Lee had made the most important discovery of all while working in the council's agricultural division. The food distribution system was another tool of control that kept junior species dependent on senior members. Agricultural planets owned by junior species were required to export most of their food production to council reserves. This food was then distributed back to junior worlds at prices that kept them perpetually in debt. Susan had learned that many junior species worlds could be self-sufficient in food production if they were allowed to use advanced techniques that senior species kept classified. Earth's agricultural technology was centuries ahead of what most junior species were permitted to use, but sharing this knowledge was strictly forbidden without council approval. Working through the network that Matt and Joe had established, Susan began quietly distributing Earth's farming techniques to agricultural specialists on junior species worlds. Simple improvements in soil management, crop rotation, and irrigation could increase food production by 30 to 50%. These improvements were small enough to avoid council attention but large enough to reduce dependence on senior species. Food shipments. Engineer Paul Clark made the breakthrough that would change everything. While working on routine maintenance of council communication systems, he had been studying the technology that senior species used to maintain their dominance. The Karathi devices that controlled interstellar communication were incredibly advanced, but they followed logical principles that human engineers could understand. Paul spent months carefully analyzing discarded Karathi components and reading technical manuals that senior species assumed junior members could not comprehend. Humans had always been good at reverse engineering technology, taking apart complex devices to understand how they worked. The Karathi had not expected a species with only a few hundred years of technological development to decode systems that had taken them millennia to perfect. The encrypted communication device that Paul built in his workshop was crude compared to official council technology, but it worked. More importantly, It was completely invisible to Council monitoring systems because it used communication frequencies that senior species had never bothered to secure. They had assumed that junior species lacked the technical knowledge to access those frequencies. The first message Paul sent through his new device reached Matt Thompson's Cultural Exchange office within minutes. The message was simple but revolutionary. Junior species could now communicate with each other without senior species oversight. The network that had been building through personal meetings and hidden cargo shipments could now operate in real time across the galaxy. Admiral Carter received the first comprehensive report from the network 3 months later. The data was staggering in its scope and devastating in its implications. 47 junior species were contributing detailed information about Council exploitation, and the pattern was identical across all of them. Resource extraction, technological suppression, economic manipulation, and political control had been refined into a system that had operated unchanged for thousands of years, but the report also contained something that gave Admiral Carter hope. The junior species controlled more territory and resources than she had realized. Their combined populations outnumbered the senior species by nearly 20 to 1. If they could work together and coordinate their actions, they had the potential to break free from the system that had enslaved them. The network began planning for something that had never happened in Council history. Instead of individual species making isolated protests that could be easily suppressed, they would coordinate a collective response to Council exploitation. They would share resources, technology, and strategic planning to create an alternative to the existing power structure. Dr. Emma Walsh used her xenobiology expertise to analyze the psychological profiles of senior species leaders. She discovered that they genuinely believed their own propaganda about guiding and protecting younger civilizations. They had convinced themselves that the exploitation system was beneficial to junior species, who were supposedly too immature to manage their own affairs. This psychological blindness was a weakness that could be exploited. The senior species would not expect coordinated resistance because they had never seen junior members as capable of independent action. They would continue to underestimate the intelligence and determination of the species they had spent millennia oppressing. The network grew stronger each day as more junior species joined the secret communication system. Information flowed freely between worlds that had been isolated from each other for centuries. Technical knowledge was shared, economic strategies were discussed, and for the first time in galactic history, the oppressed species began to see themselves as part of a larger community. Senior council members continued their ancient routines, making speeches about cooperation while maintaining their grip on power. They noticed that junior species seemed more confident lately, but they attributed this to the civilizing influence of council membership. They had no idea that beneath their feet a revolution was taking shape that would shatter their comfortable world forever. The council chambers had never been so tense as they were on the morning of the annual resource allocation meeting. Admiral Lisa Carter sat in her designated seat in the junior section, but something was different about her posture today. For 3 years, she had listened politely to decisions that stripped resources from human colonies while enriching senior species worlds. Today would be different. Speaker Theron rose from his ornate chair in the center of the senior circle, his shimmering skin catching the light from the chamber's crystal ceiling. The Zephyrian leader had conducted this same ceremony for over 2 centuries, and his voice carried the confident authority of someone who had never been challenged. The annual resource allocation was always a formality, where senior species announced their requirements and junior species accepted their obligations. The holographic displays around the chamber showed detailed breakdowns of mineral extraction, quotas, agricultural export requirements, and manufacturing assignments for each junior species world. The numbers were staggering in their scope and devastating in their impact on the civilizations forced to meet them. Admiral Carter watched as Speaker Theron announced the new quotas for human colonies. 3 worlds would be required to increase their mining operations by 40%. Despite the fact that current extraction rates were already causing environmental damage that would take centuries to repair, Two agricultural colonies would export 80% of their food production, leaving barely enough to feed their own populations. But the quota that made Admiral Carter's blood boil was the assignment for New Terra, humanity's newest colony. The world was home to 50,000 colonists, including 8,000 children who depended on the planet's resources for their education and medical care. The Council was demanding mining quotas that would require shutting down schools and hospitals to redirect workers to the extraction facilities. Admiral Carter had spent months preparing for this moment. The network of junior species had provided her with detailed evidence of how the resource allocation system worked. She had economic analyses showing how senior species profited from junior species labor. She had environmental reports documenting the long-term damage caused by excessive extraction quotas. Most importantly, she had the backing of 18 other junior species who were ready to stand with humanity when Speaker Theron finished reading the human quotas and asked for formal acceptance. Admiral Carter stood up slowly. The chamber fell, silent as representatives from across the galaxy turned to watch. In 10,000 years of Council history, no junior species had ever refused a resource allocation. The concept was so unthinkable that most beings simply stared in confusion. Admiral Carter's voice carried clearly through the vast chamber as she spoke. The word that would change galactic history forever. No, the single syllable echoed off the crystal walls and seemed to hang in the air like a physical presence. Senior species representatives looked at each other in shock, unable to process what they had just heard. Speaker Theron's expression shifted from confusion to cold anger as he asked Admiral Carter to repeat herself. His voice carried the chill of deep space and the implied threat of consequences that no junior species wanted to face. But Admiral Carter had passed the point where threats could influence her decisions. She repeated her refusal more clearly, adding that humanity would no longer participate in a system that enriched senior species while impoverishing the civilizations that did the actual work. The human colonies would keep their resources for their own development rather than shipping them to worlds that already had more wealth than they could use. The explosion of outrage from the senior species section was immediate and overwhelming. Council members who had sat in dignified silence for millennia suddenly erupted in angry shouts and demands for order. War Prime Kector of the Vorthok stood up with his massive frame trembling in fury, demanding that the humans be expelled immediately for their insubordination, but Admiral Carter was not finished. She activated her personal datapad and uploaded a massive file to the Council's public information network. The file contained 3 years of research compiled by the Junior Species Network, documenting every aspect of the exploitation system that had operated in secret for thousands of years. The evidence was devastating in its completeness. Communication. Records between senior species leaders discussing how to keep junior members permanently subjugated. Economic analyses showing how resource extraction quotas were calculated to maximize senior species profits while keeping junior worlds in poverty. Military assessments revealing how fleet deployments were designed to prevent junior species from developing independent defense capabilities. Dr. Emma Walsh had helped prepare psychological profiles of senior species leaders that revealed their genuine belief that they were entitled to rule over younger civilizations. The profiles showed a deep-seated arrogance that prevented them from seeing junior species as equals or even as fully intelligent beings worthy of respect. The most damning evidence came from historical records that Dr. Matt Thompson had uncovered. During his cultural research, the records showed that several junior species had been deliberately destroyed when they became too independent or started asking too many questions about council policies. These species had simply vanished from galactic civilization, their worlds abandoned and their people scattered. General Alan Cooper had coordinated the military intelligence portion of the data release. His analysis showed how senior species maintained control through a combination of economic pressure and the implied threat of violence. Junior species were kept weak and divided while senior species maintained overwhelming military superiority. As the evidence spread through the Council's information networks, Representatives from junior species worlds began accessing the files on their personal devices. Many were seeing the full scope of their exploitation for the first time, learning how their suffering fit into a galaxy-wide system of oppression that had operated for millennia. Admiral Carter addressed the chamber. Once more, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around her. She explained that humanity had come to the Council in good faith, seeking partnership among the stars. Instead, they had found a cosmic plantation system designed to keep most species in permanent servitude with extra steps to make it seem legitimate. The human delegation began walking toward the chamber exits, but they were not alone. Ambassador Yukiner of the Kelrani stood up and followed them, his mathematical mind having calculated that cooperation with other junior species offered better odds than continued submission to senior species exploitation. The Torvan representative joined them, followed by delegates from 16 other junior species, who had finally had enough of waiting for permission to live as free beings. Speaker Theron watched them leave with that same dismissive smile that had infuriated junior species for centuries. His voice carried across the chamber as he told his fellow senior members that the rebels would be back within a few months. Where else could they go without council protection and guidance? But War Prime Kekther was less confident about the situation. The Vorthek military leader had read the intelligence reports and understood their implications better than his colleagues. The junior species now possessed detailed information about council weaknesses and had demonstrated an ability to coordinate their actions across multiple star systems. The senior species spent the rest of the day debating how to respond to the unprecedented challenge to their authority. Some wanted to send military forces to compel the rebel species back into compliance. Others preferred economic sanctions that would force them to return to council control. A few suggested diplomatic negotiations, though they could not imagine making any real concessions to beings they considered inferior. None of them understood that the junior species had been preparing for this moment for months. The network that humanity had helped build was already implementing plans that would make council retaliation difficult and ultimately futile. Supply chains were being redirected, defensive alliances were being formalized, and technological knowledge was being shared at an unprecedented rate. As Admiral Carter and her allies walked through the corridors of Nexus Prime, they carried with them the hopes of billions of beings who had suffered under council rule for thousands of years. The confrontation in the chambers had been just the beginning of a transformation that would reshape galactic civilization. The senior species would soon learn that keeping people oppressed for millennia had created something they never expected: a network of civilizations with nothing left to lose and everything to gain from working together. The galaxy was about to change forever, and the Council's ancient grip on power was beginning to slip away like sand through their fingers. Captain Lisa Park stood on the bridge of the evacuation fleet flagship New Freedom as hundreds of ships prepared for departure from Council space. 3 months had passed since the confrontation in the Council chambers, and humanity had used every day to prepare for the largest peaceful migration in galactic history. The exodus was not just about leaving, it was about taking their friends with them and building something better than what they were abandoning. The evacuation had been planned with military precision but executed with the efficiency that humans brought to everything they did. Admiral Carter had coordinated with the Junior Species Network to ensure that the departure would cause maximum disruption to Council operations while maintaining the moral high ground that made their cause sympathetic to neutral observers. Dr. Matt Thompson had spent weeks helping other species prepare their own evacuation plans. The Kelrani brought their mathematical expertise and computational technology. The Torvan contributed their advanced manufacturing capabilities. 12 other species added their own specialties to what was becoming a comprehensive alternative to Council civilization. But the real genius of the evacuation plan came from engineer Paul Clark, who had figured out how to turn humanity's integration into Council society into a weapon against the system itself. Humans had not been content to sit quietly in their assigned roles during their 3 years of membership. They had volunteered for positions throughout council space, learning how everything worked and making themselves essential to operations that senior species had taken for granted. Human doctors staffed medical facilities on over 200 council worlds because senior species found healing arts beneath their dignity. Human engineers maintained critical infrastructure that had been built by ancient automation systems that senior species no longer understood. Human merchants operated 34% of the galaxy's shipping networks because trade was considered a mundane activity unworthy of senior species' attention. The departure began quietly, with merchant vessels simply failing to arrive at their scheduled destinations. Medical staff submitted resignation notices and boarded transport ships bound for the frontier territories beyond council space. Engineers completed their final maintenance reports and then vanished into the vast network of ships carrying the exodus to freedom. Captain Joe Martinez coordinated the shipping evacuation from his modified merchant vessel. His network of trusted captains had spent months repositioning ships and supplies to support the mass departure. When the evacuation began, entire trade routes simply stopped functioning as human-operated vessels redirected to rendezvous points in empty space. The senior council members initially celebrated the departure of the rebellious species. War Prime Kector declared good riddance to ungrateful civilizations that had failed to appreciate council guidance. Speaker Theron made speeches about how the galaxy would be more peaceful without troublemakers who refused to accept their proper place in the galactic order, but the celebration lasted only until the first supply ships failed to arrive at senior species worlds. The Zephyrian homeworld had not received a medical supply shipment in 6 weeks, and their hospitals were running out of critical medications that human-operated facilities had been producing. The Karathi industrial centers were discovering that their automated systems required maintenance expertise that only human engineers possessed. Dr. Susan Lee had prepared one final gift for the council before her departure. Her analysis of the agricultural system revealed that senior species worlds had become completely dependent on food imports from junior species planets. Without the coordination provided by human agricultural specialists, the complex distribution network that fed billions of beings across council space began breaking down within weeks. Lieutenant Amy Foster's security analysis had identified the critical infrastructure that senior species could not maintain without junior species support. Power generation systems, transportation networks, and communication arrays all required technical knowledge that had been deliberately kept from senior species leaders as a security measure. The same secrecy that had been used to maintain control now left them helpless when their technical staff departed. The cascade failures began 6 months after the exodus started. Medical emergencies developed on worlds that could no longer manufacture life-saving drugs. Industrial accidents occurred when automated systems failed without proper maintenance. Agricultural worlds faced famine when distribution networks collapsed under the weight of incompetent management. Dr. Emma Walsh had predicted the psychological impact that the exodus would have on senior species leaders. For thousands of years, they had believed their own propaganda about the natural superiority of ancient civilizations over younger species. The rapid collapse of their society without junior species support forced them to confront the reality that they had become parasites, living off the labor of beings they considered inferior. The most devastating blow came when 12 additional junior species announced their intention to join the exodus. These were civilizations that had remained loyal to the Council during the initial confrontation, hoping that reforms might be possible. But watching the senior species' response to the crisis had convinced them that the system could never be changed from within. Speaker Theron stood in the same chamber where he had dismissed humanity's concerns just 1 year earlier. The room was half empty now, with dozens of species having departed for the frontier territories where humanity and their allies were building their new confederation. Economic reports painted a picture of systematic collapse that threatened the foundation of galactic civilization. The speaker's hands trembled as he dictated the message that his pride had delayed for too long. He instructed the Council's diplomatic corps to contact the human territories and request negotiations. The Council was willing to discuss reforms to address the legitimate concerns that had been raised by departing species. The response from the Human Confederation arrived within hours, transmitted through the same communication networks that engineer Paul Clark had designed to coordinate the exodus. The message was brief and polite, thanking the Council for their offer but respectfully declining to return to a system that had exploited them for years. Admiral Carter's final communication to the Council explained that humanity and their allies were busy building something better than what they had left behind. The new Confederation was based on principles of genuine equality and mutual respect rather than the false promises that had characterized Council membership. They had no interest in reforming a system that was fundamentally designed to maintain the dominance of a few species over many others. The territories beyond Council space were becoming home to a new kind of galactic civilization. Human agricultural techniques were feeding populations that had known hunger for centuries. Kelrani computational systems were solving problems that Council science had declared impossible. Torvin manufacturing facilities were producing goods that surpassed anything made in Council space. Dr. Betty Adams transmitted the final message from the Human Confederation before the communication links were permanently severed. Her words would haunt the senior species for generations as they struggled to understand how their perfect system had collapsed so completely. She told them that they had never bothered to ask what junior species were good at, too busy keeping them down to notice that they were holding the entire galactic civilization together. War Prime Kekther raged about military solutions and demanded that Council fleets be sent to force the rebel species back into compliance. But General Alan Cooper's intelligence reports had already reached neutral species throughout the galaxy, and public opinion was turning against the Council. Military action would only confirm what everyone was beginning to suspect about the true nature of Council rule. The senior species were forced to confront a galaxy that no longer feared or respected them. The ancient Council chambers echoed with empty speeches about tradition and order while outside their windows. Ships departed daily for the frontier territories where freedom and opportunity awaited anyone willing to work for them. Years later, historians would mark the Exodus as the moment when galactic civilization truly began. The old system based on dominance and exploitation gave way to something unprecedented in the galaxy's history. A confederation built on cooperation, respect, and the radical idea that all intelligent species deserve the right to determine their own destiny. The Council still existed, ruling over a shrinking collection of worlds that grew smaller each year as more species chose freedom over security. But their relevance had faded like starlight at dawn, overwhelmed by the brightness of something new and better rising beyond their reach. In the vast territories where humanity and their allies built their future, the stars themselves seemed to sing with the joy of beings finally free to reach their full potential among the infinite possibilities of space.